All right, everyone. For this week, unfortunately, I have a kind of a series of screencasts. I know that they can be brutal, but this is the kind of the most effective way I could update the numbers and in the slides, which you'll see what I mean in a minute, but still have the amount of time necessary to kind of get this information to you. So aside from that, though, it's a normal week, and for this week, we're talking about population and migration. And this is a big issue in Latin America, obviously, and it also affects us here in the United States. Favelas in Rio or Mexico City, the slums that we actually have talked about in our discussion forums a little bit, they make good stories, and they're definitely famous examples of overcrowded cities, but the demographic reality of Latin America is actually pretty different than auto-constructed homes up the side of a mountain like we see here. Today, we're unfortunately going to have to deal with a lot of numbers, really, for this week. But I'm going to introduce one important concept called the demographic transition, and then talk a little bit about something else that's kind of important in the context of Latin America called chain migration. But first we're going to start out with kind of an overview of some of the important things, just kind of general things that we should kind of take away from this discussion, or at least the situation with demographics, race, and population numbers and locations in Latin America. So that's the first screencast that we're going to do here. The next one down is just going to be some overall world population and regional population numbers. And some demographic ideas. The next one after that is going to be the demographic transition. And then we're going to talk about migration and end up with a little bit of discussion of migration from Mexico, illegal immigration issues, and remittances. So it's a lot of information, actually. And it's covered in chapters, I think, 9 and 20 in your textbook. But let's start with one of the big ideas in Latin America, and that's actually the idea that Latin America has become progressively, and the quotes are important here, whiter over time, more and more white. So in this case, a little bit ironically, darker shades on the map indicate a higher percentage of African populations, and this map on the right is going to change over time. And the first map here is for 1800. So this is Afro-American Latin America in 1800, and it shows us the percent of black and mulatto or mixed race individuals is a proportion of the total population for each country. Some countries have no data or they're not mapped. The U.S. is not mapped. Neither is Haiti or the Guyanas. And no data countries in certain years include Central America, and perhaps one of these countries here in Latin America will pop up that way. One thing that we should point out, and that relates to this, is that the Latin America and the Caribbean has had actually a better history of, at least in comparison to the U.S., better history of the integration of Africans and indigenous people into cultural heritage. And so if we move forward over time here, can move to 1900, so 100 years later, and we have still a lot of no data. But if you notice here, we have kind of a change, right? Argentina becomes much lighter in terms of skin tone, and the proportion, or at least the number of people who are black or mixed race, and Brazil and Venezuela and Colombia, all three places where with at least a non-inconsequential population of African slaves become lighter by 1900, that is in whiter skin. By 2000, this continues to happen even more, to the point where we have very low proportions of Afro-Latin Americans in much of Latin America by 2000. Now think of it this way: in the U.S., we're maybe 13% African American, depending on the year, and compare that to a lot of countries in Latin America, which are 0 to 4%, right? The changes on the west coast of South America and Central America over these maps are pretty substantial, and this has been due to a much greater acceptance of intermarriage, among other things. Some's also due to different ideas relating to race. So, in the history of Latin America and the Caribbean, the doctrine was that one drop of white blood made you white blood being white heritage, whereas in North America we still, most of us anyway, and most of us subconsciously feel it's the other way around. That if you have African heritage in your family's history, that you might be countable as black, right? So there's kind of a fundamental difference here when we talk about race in Latin America. It's very different than the American experience of race, which is really different from all around the world. It's one of the kind of true exceptionalist things in the United States. Another thing is something we already know. In Latin America, we had a number of centers of domestication for crops, including potatoes in the Andes, maize or corn in Mexico, and manioc in the Amazon. And these are three global food staples, and they're really important in Latin America's history. And it turns out that when we look at where these centers of domestication were, Mexico for corn, the Andes for potatoes, and the Amazon for manioc, it turns out that with the exception of the Amazon, we're actually looking at major population centers today at some of these locations of important gene banks, which happen to correspond to significant agricultural areas in the past. So you can kind of look at Latin America's population centers for the most part as being, with the Amazon being a big exception, as being kind of a holdover today. We have these large cities in these locations. So that's kind of an overview, but there's definitely some more specifics that are really important, which the second screencast will get to. I'm going to try to keep these less than 10 minutes long, although two of them might get a little bit longer.